The Australian Financial Review.
Jon Adgemis, the model-dating, Maserati-driving restaurateur, is about to face his biggest challenge yet.
Last August, Financial Review reporters Primrose Riordan and Max Mason were covering the $1.8 billion implosion of Jon Adgemis's pub group.
We were standing outside this creditors' meeting, which was happening in a hotel in Sydney City, waiting for Adgemis. And when he eventually emerged from the meeting, he had this entourage around him. And we asked a few questions, which were ignored. He jumped into the lift with his entourage, and we just followed him in there.
But Riordan, who was 6 months pregnant at the time, was blocked from entering the lift by one of Adgemis's associates. The exchange was picked up by Mason on his recorder.
Are you a guest in the hotel?
Seriously? Jon, come on.
I think it showed that he was really allergic to any scrutiny around what had happened and didn't want to offer his own explanation.
Adgemis is doing everything he can to keep secret the events surrounding the failure of his hospitality empire, which at its peak spanned 22 venues. The high-profile former banker recently delayed his appearance at a court hearing into the collapse, and he's trying to ensure any evidence he does give is behind closed doors. But Adgemis couldn't stop the court appearance this month of his former chief financial officer.
Alexander Andruska took the stand. We weren't expecting much. This was a guy who'd been working with Jon for more than a decade. You can imagine our surprise when suddenly there's just these huge allegations. It just all came tumbling out of him.
The public examination of Adgemis's downfall is not just about one man's reckless borrowing. It also sheds light on the private credit market, which is facing its own reckoning. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Associate Editor Primrose Riordan and Courts Correspondent Max Mason on how Jon Adgemis went from aspiring pub baron to bankrupt in 10 years, why he's struggling to keep the details of his financial collapse secret, and what his story tells us about the private credit market's current woes. It's Thursday, August 27. Hi, Primrose. Hi, Max. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Hello.
Glad to be here.
Primrose and Max, you've both been following this story for years. You didn't get your chance to interview Jon Adgemis in that lift last year, but you're well across the details. Primrose, tell us about the hearing that is currently underway and what you thought when Jon Adgemis's former CFO took the stand and said far more than anyone was expecting.
Yeah. Jon Adgemis is now Australia's biggest bankrupt since Alan Bond. He owes creditors, which include the banks, private credit lenders, suppliers, staff, his own family, a total of $1.8 billion. He was forced into bankruptcy in October last year, which was quite a big moment. One of his biggest creditors is the Australian Tax Office, which claims Adgemis owes more than $160 million to them. So this hearing came about to really examine how this all happened. So that was kind of all the financial dealings around this collapse. It's quite rare for a bankrupt to be subject to these sort of cross-examinations in a court. When Adgemis was called 2 weeks ago to front up and be examined, he really resisted any public airing of the details surrounding this huge collapse. Even though he attended court on that day, he didn't actually give any evidence because his lawyers put on these interlocutory applications, which included trying to close the court so that the media and the public couldn't actually watch him be examined. All those kind of applications, it wasn't just about the closed court, there were other ones, basically delayed this whole thing and delayed him facing questions. He then stands down from the witness box, exits the room without actually answering any questions. But that didn't mean that all the other people who were called to give evidence, that their hearings didn't go ahead. A very, very important lieutenant for him, Alexander Andruska, who was the former chief financial officer of Adgemis's private company, did take the stand.
Okay.
He came across as someone who just didn't really have anything to lose. He'd obviously lost his job with John. He was no longer working for federal politician Andrew Bragg, and it all just kept tumbling out. He said it was very stressful working for Adgemis. He even said, and I'm quoting here from the evidence, "I wanted to bloody blow my brains out."
Oh.
He then made allegations about what he called dodgy GST claims. He said that John was aware, and I quote again, "they were like dodgy claims," Andruska said. And he said that these GST claims had very little basis. When companies purchase goods and services that they need to run their business, they can claim refunds for the GST.
Okay.
If the expenses surpass their income for the period.
So if they're doing a renovation and they're spending lots of money on that renovation and it's more than the income they're getting, they can claim a GST refund.
That's right. But they're only really required to provide receipts in the event of an audit. Eventually, of course, they were audited, and the ATO claims and has alleged that these companies claimed spending of over $1 billion and received $78 million in GST refunds. And that was between 2021 and 2024. And Driscoll also made this comment that despite the fact that he was the CFO, he didn't really ever have the full picture, and he claimed that Adgemis operated in information silos and that he just felt so confused about what was going on. Now we have the CFO, so the main money man of Adgemis's businesses, up on the stand, laying this entire plan out from when it was allegedly cooked up to now, and how it funded the pub group, and it also funded his lifestyle, which is the claim from Andruska.
So we'll talk more about this shocking evidence. But first, Max, let's go right back to the very beginning. What is Jon Adgemis's story? How did he get started?
Well, Adgemis grew up in Sydney's wealthy eastern suburbs. He was the son of migrants from Castellarizo in the Greek islands. His father died when he was quite young, and in an interview he did at the height of his sort of pub baron days, he talked about his childhood and his parents working quite hard.
He taught me from a very young age the importance of doing a hard day's work.
And he was actually able to attend one of the country's most expensive schools, Cranbrook. He went on from there to study at the University of Sydney.
I actually was working in the Sydney fish markets for a family friend.
He was working at the fish markets
on the weekends while I was at university. And
he went to KPMG.
Put all my tutorials on one day and did 4 days at KPMG.
And then he also had a stint at investment bank Gresham Partners. He then returned to KPMG in 2005 as the firm ramped up its work on mergers and acquisitions.
KPMG were looking at that time to younger partners.
In 2007, he's going so well that he becomes KPMG's youngest partner at 28.
I never really wanted those sorts of titles. I was more focused on my clients.
And he was developing quite the profile at the time.
Yes, exactly. You sort of saw him in gossip pages, particularly in the Daily Telegraph and things like that. He was known for these big deals, fast cars, friendships with rich listers. We had a Rear Window column at the time that said, "We spotted Adgemis cruising along Phillip Street in a soft-top black Maserati. The convertible retracted to let the hot spring breeze tussle the most coveted locks in Australian M&A."
Wow, there you go.
He developed a client list that mixed friendship and business, notably with eccentric rich listers.
I had earmarked those families through either people I knew or alternatively through the KPMG network.
Including retailer Jan Cameron and Win Television owner Bruce Gordon.
The Gordon family was one of those. They were an old client of KPMG through the Wollongong practice and just wanted to be their trusted advisor.
That's when I first came into contact with him. I was covering the media round and he'd grown so close to Bruce Gordon that in 2016, it was around the time that he'd just revealed that he'd bought one of his first pubs while still working at KPMG. He attended Nine's annual general meeting on behalf of Bruce Gordon, who was then sort of living in Bermuda.
And was everyone sort of wondering who's this banker representing a billionaire part owner of Nine?
Well, everyone knew who he was, but I think everyone was kind of like, that's quite surprising that an advisor would turn up as the representative.
Yeah.
So that was quite surprising at the time.
And so, Primrose, around this time, as Max says, Adgemis bought his first pub while he was still working at KPMG. How did he go from a few real estate investments on the side to an aspiring pub baron?
When he was at KPMG, that's when he started to buy these properties. His first pubs were the Exchange Hotels in Balmain and Darlinghurst. And he used this network that he had grown from being an advisor on these deals at KPMG to get some of the money. So he borrowed money from friends, including Jan Cameron. And his plan really with a lot of the pubs and his public hospitality group, which was the name of the company in which he eventually started, was to buy these off-Broadway, unloved pubs that weren't in the best location at an affordable price.
Bought some pub assets
and really glow them up.
Ground level hospitality, accommodation into a rooftop.
This was sort of adding a fancy restaurant with a sort of buzzy chef and changing the accommodation that's often upstairs of these pubs into boutique hotel rooms, kind of flip it and turn a profit.
So it wasn't a bad idea, really, because there's not a lot of accommodation in Sydney. He'd sort of spotted that opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. It was true that Sydney doesn't have enough accommodation, and it was a good idea in that way. We also know of another pub group, Merivale, who's done that very well.
He wanted to be the next Justin Hems.
He did. He was doing other deals at the time, and his co-investors included pub and nightclub developer Greg McGree, a close associate of King's Cross personality Jon Ibrahim. Then after he left KPMG, there was a few things that happened in between, but essentially during the pandemic,
I wanted to take advantage of the lockdowns.
He started really buying up a lot more venues and pubs, and during the pandemic there was a perception that prices were low.
The deals in which we were finding at that time, there were much more of them at much better pricing in that pub world.
And he was able to buy up quite a number of good and questionable properties, including Noah's Backpackers in Bondi. So he sort of started to create this portfolio, and his public hospitality group would eventually span 22 venues. As we've found out since then, of course, he didn't buy all this in cash. He used money that was from his network of high net worth individuals and also other lenders in order to buy them. That was how he became this aspiring pub baron.
So he was accruing a lot of assets, but he was also accruing a lot of debt. And Max, the good times didn't last. The borrowing caught up with Adgemis and he ended up falling out with two of his rich lister backers. What happened?
I mean, that was a couple of the early red flags. He ended up blowing up these relationships with Jan Cameron and Bruce Gordon, people that he'd been close with for over a decade. Jan Cameron was lending money to John for some of his projects outside KPMG. In the case of Cameron, he became the Australian Securities and Investment Commission's star witness in a prosecution of Cameron over her alleged failure to disclose a 15% shareholding in the listed dairy business Bellamy, which was a criminal prosecution. And it was held within this structure in a tax haven in the Caribbean, which John had actually set up years earlier. So Adgemis ended up paying back the money that he owed Jan Cameron. She would later say that she was glad to have him out of her life, which was a pretty extraordinary statement for somebody who was so close to John. With Bruce Gordon, there was another fallout with money. Before Adgemis formed Public Hospitality Group, he wanted to redevelop land in Sydney's Crow's Nest, near Crow's Nest Station.
This is when he was investing in real estate at KPMG.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He needed money and he borrowed from his network again. Gordon sued in 2021 over a $10 million loan that he'd not paid back. The Gordon suit and an attempt to bankrupt Adgemis in late 2020 by another company involved in the Crow's Nest development even involved sheriffs being sent to his house.
Okay.
And that's quite a big deal to have sheriffs on your door. The sheriffs went to his home in Sydney's wealthy suburb of Rose Bay, and they tried to recover enough assets to pay back the debt. This was one of the first big red flags on the public record about the issues in John's business. And it was after this incident and after the publication of these court documents that bank and non-bank lenders continued to lend to John, and these red flags were totally ignored. As we talked about, he had bought all this stuff during the pandemic when rates were low, But as we know, the central bank started to hike, and they hiked a number of times in a very short period. He was taking on so much debt, he couldn't really go to the banks anymore for more debt. He had to go to other avenues, private credit lenders, and they charge much higher interest rates. There's a number of factors going on. There's rising construction costs. Banks became much more risk adverse. They really pared back their business lending. This borrowing by Adgemis coincided with the growth of private credit in Australia. There was a lot of money to be made, not just for these private credit businesses, but for the investors in these private credit businesses, which is a lot of people who are putting some of their retirement money into this because they're seeing that was more attractive than the basic rate that you're getting through your super fund.
They could get higher returns.
Exactly. There wasn't a lot of discussion at the time about the risk, especially because you can make higher rates from more difficult borrowers or borrowers with more difficult credit histories. And there was a question about whether or not these private credit funds were disclosing to retiree investors about the true nature of the credit histories of some of these borrowers. I was having discussions with investors who had no idea that the fund that they had invested in was lending to this guy who was every second week in the AFR over questions about his pub empire. The other aspect of this is that Adgemis was borrowing money against his properties, and the way that he was able to borrow a lot more money is that he would get a valuer to do a valuation based on what his pub would look like were it to be totally renovated and were it to have tenants such as the restaurant. So this valuation was not what the pub looked like now, it was what the pub would look like were it were like a Merivale venue. And so he was able to borrow a lot more money.
Yeah, because he could borrow against that higher value.
This theoretical value. It almost became quite farcical because in some cases the theoretical tenant was somebody even linked to Adgemis's companies. There was a question of how he was able to service any of this, and in some cases construction would just stop at some venues. And then in 2023, Joe Aston, who was then the Rear Window editor, had a scoop on how much Adgemis was borrowing. And he revealed back then that Public Hospitality Group, that's Adgemis's pub company, owed $500 million against his portfolio. But it would get much worse. By the time he declared bankruptcy in October last year, he owed $1.8 billion. In terms of bankruptcies, that puts him up there with Alan Bond. And for me, it leaves this burning question of how could so many apparently intelligent people lend so much money to Adgemis in the first place?
We're talking about Jon Adgemis and how he went from banker to the billionaires to aspiring pub baron to debt-laden bankrupt. Max, let's look at how it all unravelled. The AFR reported in 2023 that Adgemis's pub group owed $500 million, and that was quite shocking at the time, but it was about to get much worse. When did the problems and the debt pile get much bigger?
Well, it was around this time that the wheels started falling off. Adgemis's financial troubles were sort of finally out in the open. Several of his venues were closed and they weren't making any money. That's particularly problematic if you've got a venue that's borrowed a lot of money and it's not making any money. So you're getting the interest rates that Primrose spoke about in the high teens. That just keeps racking up and racking up. He took on more loans to pay these debts and there were fallings out with more business partners and more collaborators. The financial difficulties left it completely on the brink of collapse by 2024. Then Deutsche Bank stepped in. Deutsche Bank did this refinancing, but the deal split public hospitality into 3 asset pools, and Deutsche Bank got security over some of the best assets, including Noah's Backpackers in Bondi.
So he was up against the wall, but he was still doing these deals.
Still doing
to
deals,
rescue
still
his
delaying,
business.
still working. More of these assets were sold to pay debts in May 2024. The tax office raided his home and office in May 2024. And the ATO has been investigating Adgemis and his companies for well over a year. He has potential tax debts of just under $300 million across 27 companies. according to some documents that we've cited. At this stage, the ATO claims it is owed $162 million by Adgemis personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's sort of around this time we're hearing stories of this chaos and dysfunction as a result of all of these financial problems. Just picking out one instance, one subcontractor who was waiting for payment went as far as to hold the paperwork for the gas connection to one venue hostage, which meant that the staff had to go out and get gas bottles because they didn't have a gas connection. You know, in another instance, staff were told not to use panic buttons at one of his pubs because it cost too much money. And there was a lot of people waiting to be paid.
Adgemis even allegedly mortgaged an investment property that he co-owned with his mother without telling her. His sister and nephew were living there until La Trobe Financial took possession of the house in July last year. The last straw was a falling out with Richard Ghazal, the son of the late rag trader Joe Ghazal, who was chasing him for a $26 million debt. So Ghazal had been chasing him for this debt for well over a year, and obviously the debt was much more than what he'd actually borrowed to begin with. Ghazal had sort of been stopped from pursuing that during a process of personal insolvency that Adgemis tried to go through. Finally, in October last year, he tried to declare himself bankrupt with $1.8 billion in debt. You could see how angry the ATO was about this, that one day he tried to declare bankruptcy himself. The ATO went to court itself and went, well, no, we're going to be the ones that make you bankrupt, so that he couldn't do it himself.
So that brings us back to this month's public examination of the events leading up to the Adgemis Pub Group's collapse and the dramatic evidence of his former CFO, Alexander Andruska. Primrose, how did they first meet and how did they come to be working together?
They have a really long history. So Andruska met Adgemis when Adgemis was still at KPMG. Andruska was working for Adgemis's brother-in-law at the time, Michael Walker. And Walker asked him to look at the finances of this company that Adgemis was invested in called Freenet. Adgemis was a major investor in the technology startup, and the startup claimed it was rolling out these wireless networks in city centres. But it turned out that the whole thing was a ruse. And Andruska helped spot that the company's director, Jonathan Parker, had actually been issuing fake invoices. Anyway, it was liquidated in 2014. Parker was subsequently convicted of fraud, sentenced to a couple of years in prison. Adgemis lost money. But he kept on, this guy who's first spotted some of these issues. And for the next decade, really, Andruska was there. He was around when John was doing this ambitious property development in Crow's Nest, which drew in these wealthy investors, but ultimately left him with, as we mentioned, the sheriff on his door.
So they've known each other for a long time, but Andruska didn't hold back when giving evidence.
No, he didn't hold back. One of the most interesting things he said was that in 2022, when Adgemis was living in the Bang & Olufsen house in Sydney's Point Piper, which is obviously a very, very wealthy part of Sydney, and the house is, you know, quite prominent on the harbour side, John called him to the house, which Andruska said was actually pretty strange and a weird thing for John to do. And he said that John allegedly said to him, and I quote, I desperately need money. What can you think of? Andruska said they conceived of this legitimate means of raising some quick funds. They accrued expenses from a company called Public Projects, which needed to invoice another of Adgemis's companies. He testified that it sort of spiraled out of control, and the money from these dodgy GST claims that allegedly followed kept the business afloat, Andruska basically said. And I'll quote again from his evidence, where he says, I think John, at that point, he saw how easy it was. As the money just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it was like having the frog in the boiling pot of water.
So, Max, the hearing's still going on. What does the future look like for Adgemis? What happens from here with the hearing and the ATO investigation?
Well, as we heard earlier, delay tactics, so we don't know exactly when John is going to be examined. You know, there are some more examinations in September, which will see his accountant, David Drummond, and his sister be examined. We're still waiting to hear whether that hearing will be held in private. His barrister said that while he was not aware of criminal charges against Adgemis, there must be at least the possibility that the ATO will take the matter further. There's a whole bunch of assets that have been sold. So Deutsche Bank, when they appointed receivers to his business, they sold the pubs that they had taken control of, and they finalised those sales for about $109 million last month, making a bit of money back.
But not all of it.
No. Well, we don't know exactly how much Deutsche Bank actually put into the refinancing. Then looking further down the road, will regulators make an example of Jon? The tax office usually doesn't make big statements. A lot of the time, they're restricted by law. But when they were opposing his personal insolvency plan last year, they really let rip. The ATO said he was leading this extravagant lifestyle unbefitting of somebody facing possible bankruptcy. I mean, this has been such a public fall from grace. Adgemis has continued to live a very comfortable life for a bankrupt, living in a luxury apartment in Bondi, walking his dog along Bondi Beach, and there's a very real chance that he's made an example of.
And Primrose, if this whole collapse is a cautionary tale, what's the main message here? Who's it for?
There is a big question here about how this could have all happened. On the one hand, it really shows you the lack of due diligence in the market. Despite court records, newspaper articles, so many red flags that there were problems in Jon Adgemis's businesses, these were completely ignored by serious institutions. The funding kept coming and the circus just rolled on. There's also this question about the private credit business. A lot of superannuation money is tied up in this now as people want these higher returns from their super. And private credit lenders are chasing these higher and higher rates. This incentivises them to really search out these more distressed borrowers, like Jon Adgemis. Instead of saying, look, this borrower looks too risky, we haven't told investors exactly how risky. They just push people's savings out the door and continue to collect fees on these loans. And I think this really shows the unchecked nature of the private credit market.
Thanks, Primrose.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Max.
Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Fin. We contacted Jon Adgemis for comment, but he declined. He's previously denied any allegations of tax fraud. If you want to read more about the rise and fall of Jon Adgemis, check out the show notes. And don't forget you can listen to all Financial Review podcasts on the AFR app. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is Head of Premium Content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. I'm Lisa Murray. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.